For years, Tromelin Island was nothing but a forgotten speck of sand in the Indian Ocean. No trees, no water, no reason to believe anyone could survive there. Then in 2006, archaeologists found something impossible beneath the ruins of an old weather station: human bones. And beside them, handmade tools, shelters built from coral, and the remnants of fire that had burned for 15 years straight. They told a story no map had recorded, of 60 people abandoned by the world, left with nothing but each other and the will to refuse disappearance. This is what happened when a ship carrying illegal human cargo shattered on a reef in 1761, and when those in power decided some lives weren't worth the trouble of saving. Tromelin is less an island than an argument between coral and ocean, a low ridge of sand hurled up from the seabed and left there to be punished. No shade worth the name, no streams. The highest point barely rises above a tall man's head. When cyclones roll through, the place doesn't endure so much as vanish beneath white water and wind. It reappears after, scoured clean, as if the storm had tried to erase all evidence that anything had ever happened there. The French called it Île des Sables, Island of Sands, on their earliest charts. Later, some maps labeled it El Diable, a misprint that felt like prophecy. By any name, it was a place sailors learned to avoid. Reef water that could tear a hull open. Currents that pulled ships into the coral before lookouts could shout warnings. No harbor, no anchorage, just a ring of destruction surrounding a strip of sand that offered nothing. In 2006, a team of French archaeologists arrived expecting to catalog seabirds and document weather patterns. Instead, beneath the concrete foundation of a 1950s meteorological station, they struck bone, human bone, and beside it, objects that didn't belong to scientists or passing fishermen. Crude copper spoons, beaten from ship's metal, bowls shaped from salvaged debris, shell ornaments worn smooth by hands. The coral block foundations of shelters built thick enough to resist hurricane winds. Tens of thousands of bird bones bearing knife marks. Fish remains from species that required skill to catch. Evidence of people who had not merely waited to die. People who had lived to understand why those bones were there at all. You have to return to a summer night in 1761, and to a ship that should never have carried the cargo it did. The vessel was L'Utile the Useful, a French East India Company transport built to move goods, not to cradle human beings. In June 1761, it slipped out of Port Louis, Mauritius, then called Isle de France, and headed for Madagascar. Its captain, Jean de Lafargue, had been told explicitly not to bring enslaved people back to the colony. War with Britain made the seas dangerous. Food was scarce. The governor wanted no additional mouths, no additional complications. Lafargue understood those orders-away men who profit from disobedience often do. As obstacles to be navigated around Foul Point on Madagascar's east coast, L'Utile took on 160 Malagasy captives, many from the Betsimisaraka people. They were forced into hold, compressed into darkness and heat, with hatches secured at night to prevent revolt. Among them was a young woman named Semyavu, the humble one, who carried a child she could not yet show. The ship sailed again on July 27th, heavy with contraband that breathed. Lafargue plotted a cautious route to avoid British patrols. He also relied on charts that were wrong. On the night of July 31st, 1761, with the ship moving at a modest clip through darkness, the lookout saw pale water ahead, foam over reef. The warning came too late. The L'Utile hit coral hard enough to tear away her rudder. Waves drove the hull sideways. Planks split with a sound like timber being ripped from the earth. The ship began to break apart in the surge. Above deck, the French crew could run, grab lines, throw themselves into the sea. Below, the enslaved were trapped where they had been put, locked in a compartment designed to hold them as if they were cargo that might spoil. Water flooded the hold. Some managed to break free as the ship's structure failed. Many did not. The imbalance of freedom became lethal in minutes. By morning, the survivors counted losses. 18 French sailors drowned. 72 Malagasy captives died. Nearly half. Many still trapped below when the ship went down. The living crawled onto a strip of sand that offered no consolation. They had escaped a sinking ship only to be marooned on a sandbar that barely deserved a name. The first days on Tromelin were not noble. They were not communal. They were what you expect when a social hierarchy is washed ashore intact. The French claimed the best ground and controlled what mattered: casks of water and wine salvaged from the wreck. The Malagasy were pushed downwind, downslope, kept separate, as if separation itself could preserve the old order, even on a place where the old order had no meaning. Heat pressed down. Thirst arrived like a fever. In 3 days, dozens of Malagasy died from dehydration and exposure, while the French, rationing their stores, lost no one to thirst. The cruelty was not always loud. Often it was bureaucratic. Who held the cask? Who held the ladle? Who was deemed worth saving? Then someone made a practical decision that looked, in retrospect, like a moral one under orders. Everyone began digging. 5 meters down through coral sand, they found moisture, brackish, unpleasant, but water. It changed the calculus. Not because the French suddenly recognized shared humanity, but because survival is an unforgiving negotiator. If anyone was going to leave Tromelin alive, everyone would have to work. Command had fallen to the first officer, Barthélemy Castellan Duverne. Lafargue, shocked and likely terrified of what awaited him for illegal slaving, had collapsed into a stupor that resembled madness. Castellan was a disciplined man, and grief did not make him sentimental. His own brother had drowned in the wreck. Yet he organized the survivors with the cold focus of someone trained to build order out of catastrophe. He set them to salvaging timber and iron from a reef. He oversaw a forge made from sand, stone, and desperation. Metal was heated in fires fed by whatever the sea gave up, then hammered into nails. And the Malagasy, kidnapped, imprisoned, nearly drowned, worked on the project with a diligence that struck the French as remarkable. It shouldn't have. If your life depends on a boat being finished, you don't conserve effort for pride. Castellan offered something that functioned as both incentive and promise. When they reached land, he swore he would send a ship back for those who couldn't leave. He put it in writing, a certificate signed by officers praising the Malagasy labor and pledging rescue. In a world run on paper, he produced paper. It was the only currency he had. Over 2 months, the castaways built an ungainly lifeboat from the remnants of Luteil. They named it La Providence, as if invoking Providence might compensate for the decisions that had put them there. But physics doesn't negotiate. The boat could carry about 120 people. There were roughly 180 survivors. On September 27th, 1761, the morning arrived with the bluntness of arithmetic. The French boarded first. Every one of them. They loaded salvage possessions, personal effects, navigational instruments, tools. Among the items they chose to save were religious artifacts from the ship's chapel, a portable altar, a crucifix. They preserved symbols of their faith, while leaving behind the people who had helped craft their escape. 60 Malagasy men and women stood on the beach and watched. Semyovu was among them, visibly pregnant now. Castellan spoke to the abandoned group one last time and repeated the pledge. He would return as soon as he could. The French left 3 months of supplies: biscuits, salted meat, tools, muskets for hunting birds, and instructions for maintaining a signal fire. Then La Providence pushed off and became a dark line on a bright horizon. The people on the beach did not collapse into instant chaos. They turned back to the island and began the slow work of not dying. For days later, La Providence reached Madagascar. Castellan reported the stranded survivors immediately. The response was the first of many refusals. British controlled the waters. Officials said, no spare vessels. Too risky. When Castellan reached Mauritius and appealed to Governor de Forges-Boucher, the answer was colder. The governor did not deny that people were marooned. He denied that they were worth the trouble. They were illegal cargo, contraband, property obtained in defiance of orders. Why risk French lives to retrieve proof of a captain's crime? Castellan argued, pleaded, petitioned. He tried to mount a private effort. He came close once, then was turned back. Bureaucracy and war and indifference formed a wall more durable than coral. Eventually, defeated and ill, Castellan returned to France, carrying a promise he could not keep. He would spend years trying to make the authorities remember. Meanwhile, the people on Tromelin adapted to a place that seemed designed to erase them. Tromelin offers food the way prisons offer hope, sporadically and at a cost. Seabirds nested in vast numbers from November to March, laying eggs in shallow scrapes. Sea turtles came ashore on dark nights to lay theirs. Fish pooled in the shallows at low tide. The castaways learned these rhythms the way desert travelers learn clouds. They built shelters from coral blocks, stacking stone into walls thick enough to resist wind. In Madagascar, stone houses were often reserved for tombs. To live inside stone was to flirt with taboo. Tromelin demanded taboo. It demanded decisions that would have been unthinkable back home, and then demanded the strength to live with them. From copper and iron scavenged from the wreck, they made tools, hooks, blades, nails, then utensils, spoons, and bowls. They crafted ornaments from shell. These were not luxuries so much as assertions. When everything is stripped away, the smallest act of making something beautiful can be a refusal to become merely an animal that eats and sleeps. They kept a fire burning. It served practical purposes. Cooking, warmth, smoke as signal. But it also became an anchor. A continuous flame is a kind of calendar. It says we have not stopped. We are still here. Time in such a place changes shape. Days are defined by wind direction and tide, by the return of birds and the seasonal arrival of turtles. Weeks dissolve. Years become guesses. Children were born on Tromelin. First words in Malagasy. First steps on scalding sand. The older survivors grew quieter, then disappeared. Into the sea or into shallow graves the wind tried constantly to unmake. 2 years in, 18 castaways attempted escape on a crude raft built from the last substantial timber. They twisted fiber into rope and used hair as cordage when nothing else remained. They fashioned a sail from cloth and feathers. Then they pushed into open water and vanished. If they reached Madagascar, no record exists. If they died, as most likely, they died without witnesses, swallowed by a distance of ocean that might as well have been another world. The failed attempt took more than lives. It cost the community materials. After that, there was less wood, less cloth, fewer options. Future escape will require ingenuity bordering on the impossible. Cyclone season arrived every year like a verdict. Storm surge could cover the island. Wind could strip skin, drive sand into eyes and lungs. The coral shelters became islands within the island, crowded with people clinging to stone while the sea tried to erase them. Survivors later described nights when water rose around them and the world became noise. Yet the fire returned. The shelters were rebuilt. The routines resumed. Survival was no longer dramatic. It was mechanical. By around 1770, 9 years after the wreck, only about 15 people remained. Reports from later French officials express surprise that many of the survivors were women. More robust, some wrote, as if endurance were a curious trait rather than the product of grit, cooperation, and the grim math of who had to keep children alive. A matriarch emerged, an older woman whose authority came less from force than from experience. Decisions were made collectively, as in Malagasy village councils. Over time, the castaways developed a mixed tongue, Malagasy threaded with French words learned from sailors. They likely measured time by bird seasons and turtle nights rather than European months. Rescue became an abstract possibility, then a superstition, then something they no longer allowed themselves to imagine too vividly. And then, after 12 years, a sail appeared on the horizon. The survivors reacted like people whose instincts had been trained by disappointment. They threw fuel onto the signal fire, sent black smoke climbing, waved whatever cloth they had, screamed until throats failed. The ship saw them. It approached. Hope, dangerous, sudden, broke open. But the reef remained what it had always been. A boat launched toward shore was overturned and destroyed. The ship circled, searching for a gap. There was none. As daylight died, it sailed away. That moment, proof that the world could find them, followed by immediate abandonment, may have been the most punishing event of all. Some refused to leave the beach for days. Others sank into despair that looked like illness. It fell to the matriarch to pull them back into routine. If a ship had found them once, another might. That was the argument. It was thin, but it was something. The sighting was reported. The French authorities, shamed or stirred or simply reminded, began a series of rescue attempts. One failed in 1774, another in 1775. The island's reef turned each attempt into a coin toss. In 1775, a ship managed to put a sailor on Tromelin. More by violence of waves than by seamanship, he was thrown onto the beach and met by the remaining survivors, by them perhaps 10 or so, who surrounded him weeping and speaking a language he couldn't fully understand. He tried to communicate a plan. The ship could not land, but if they could reach it on a raft, they might be saved. The castaways built what they could from what remained. With almost no timber, they braided ropes, and even a sail from bird feathers, thousands of them, twisted together into cordage. Then 7 people took their chances. The French sailor, 3 Malagasy men, 3 Malagasy women. The raft pushed through the surf, cleared the breakers, and vanished. Whether it disintegrated, capsized, or was carried off course into open ocean is unknown. What is known is that it never returned. After that, Tromelin held only women and an infant. By 1776, the community had been reduced to its essence. 7 women and a baby boy. One was elderly, sustained by stubbornness more than strength. Others were middle-aged, shaped by 15 years of salt and loss. Semyovu was among them, now a mother again. They had watched men disappear into the sea, watched children die, watched ships arrive and fail. And still, each morning, one of them tended the fire. On November 25, 1776, a young naval officer named Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tromelin received orders to end the disgrace. Earlier missions had been defeated by coral and surf. Tromelin studied the reports and made a simple adjustment that amounted to a revolution. He brought a shallow draft pirogue, a canoe that could slip where European boats shattered. He brought Malagasy rowers who knew how to read reef water. On November 28th, his ship La Dauphine sighted the island. The next day, the weather calmed. Rare mercy. The pirogue moved through the reef and reached shore. The women did not rush forward like characters in a fable. They had learned what false hope cost. They stood, watchful, as French sailors stepped onto their beach. They wore garments woven from feathers, skirts and shawls crafted with care in a place that offered no dignity. They had manufactured it. The French officer who approached them had been briefed, but the sight still stunned him. 7 survivors who looked less like castaways than like a small, severe court, composed and weary. A baby in a woman's arms. The fire smoking behind them. When the French told them they had come take them away, the women broke, not into hysteria, but into release. 15 years of restraint and endurance spilled out in tears, in song, in prayers to God and ancestors. They gathered what few possessions they had. Copper bowls, shell trinkets, perhaps a comb made delicately from metal that could have been used for something more useful. They chose to keep traces of themselves. A note recorded from the rescue mentions a fire, that it had never gone out, whether literal or slightly romanticized. The claim fits the evidence. These women treated flame as both tool and signal, a line drawn against oblivion. On December 14, 1776, La Dauphine entered Port Louis with the survivors aboard. The colony gathered. The new governor, Jacques Maillard, met them at the dock and did something the previous administration had refused to do. He recognized them as people, not cargo. They were declared free, illegally enslaved, illegally abandoned, and therefore no one's property. Maillard offered to return them to Madagascar. The women refused. It wasn't pride. It was realism. Back on Madagascar's coast, without family protection, without a village claim, they risked being enslaved again the moment they stepped ashore. 15 years on Tromelin had made them strangers to their own homeland. Maillard, moved by their predicament, took some into his household. The infant, born into a world of sand and salt, was baptized in Port Louis. The name recorded for him included Semyovu's, preserving her identity in ink after so many had tried to reduce her to silence. News reached France. Castellan du Vern, older now, learned that the survivors had been saved. 7 women and a baby, out of the 60 he left behind. It is easy from a distance to indict him as the man who sailed away. It is harder and more honest to see him as one cog in a machine built to convert human beings into profit. He did promise to return. He failed. But he also spent years pushing against indifference, reminding officials of what they wanted to forget. Guilt can corrode, but it can also propel. His agitation helped keep the story alive until someone with authority and ingenuity finally acted. Deforges Boucher, the governor who refused rescue at the beginning, retired comfortably and defended his decision as wartime necessity. Abolitionists and intellectuals in France disagreed. The Tromelin story became a case study in the logic of slavery, how easily people become property, how quickly moral responsibility dissolves into administrative language. 2.5 centuries later, the sand still holds evidence. Archaeologists found tens of thousands of bird bones bearing cut marks, fish remains from dozens of species, suggesting skilled adaptation by people, many of them from inland regions, who had never lived by the sea. They found sets of copper spoons and bowls, numbers that hint at shared meals and communal structure rather than every person for themselves desperation. They found jewelry, bracelets, proof that beauty mattered even when survival was a daily negotiation. They found no clear signs of violence or internal conflict in the remains that were recovered, no defensive works, no pattern of injury that suggested brutality between castaways, on a scrap of land where scarcity could turn people into predators. Cooperation appears to have been the rule. What Tromelin offers, finally, is not an uplifting parable. It is an indictment and a testament, braided together. An indictment of a world that could abandon 60 people because rescuing them was inconvenient. A testament to the kind of stubborn, ordinary heroism that rarely makes it into official records. Women stacking coral blocks against cyclones, shaping copper into spoons, coaxing flame to life again and again, teaching songs to a child who had never seen a tree. Tromelin is still hard to reach. The reef still waits. The wind still scours the sand. There is a plaque now, a small acknowledgement fixed to a place that spent centuries pretending nothing happened there. It doesn't restore the dead. It doesn't undo the arithmetic of that morning in 1761, when the boat was too small and the French decided whose lives fit. But the island is no longer silent. Beneath the weather station and the shifting dunes, the story persists, pressed into coral sand, hammered into copper, carried forward by descendants and by anyone who looks at a strip of ocean and asks what it costs to survive when the world decides you don't matter.